This week we are talking about foods in the Bible. I don't know about you, but food is important in my life. And it seems like with each passing year and with each added pound, that it becomes more and more important to me. Look with me in your Bible in Genesis chapter 1, verse 29. Genesis chapter 1, verse 29. I actually meant to bring, I have an old wooden bowl, mixing bowl, really, for about lack of a better term. It's about that long, about that wide, wooden. It was, I think, my great grandmother's. And I meant to bring it to kind of help us along in this and didn't think to get it out. But anyway, in Genesis chapter 1, verse 29, God makes a statement. God said, "See, I've given you every herb and yield seed, which is on the face of all the earth, and every tree whose fruit yields seed. To you it shall be for food." God gave man food. The question that has always been, and I suppose always will be in theological circles, is, was man made mortal or was man made immortal? And it appears that man was made by God mortal. But as long as he was in the Garden of Eden, he had the right and access to the tree of life, thus immortality. And when he sinned, he was cast out of the garden, never to be able to enter it again, and thus never having the right to that tree. And one of the reasons that I say that is this very verse. He had to eat. He had to eat to keep his body going. God gave thus man, Adam, gave him seeds, if you will. And he gave him fruit of the tree, and he could eat. But then if you go over after the flood, you go over to the 9th chapter in the book of Genesis. God blessed, beginning in verse 1, Genesis chapter 9. So God blessed Noah and fly and fill the and fear of you on every beast of the earth, on every on the earth, and on all the fish, they are given into your hand. Shall be food for you. I have given you all things, even as green herbs. So now it seems like after the flood, they have the right to eat, if you will, certain meats. And so Adam and Eve, and before, you can look in Genesis 5. There's a chronology there in Genesis 5 that's I've always found interesting. You find Mahalalel and Enoch and Methuselah and others. But you find within all of those individuals, you find these folks live probably in the time where they only ate grains, only ate fruit. But then after the flood, God gave them the right to eat meat. And so food really is the point I want to make, has always been interesting and important to man. And when we study food in the Bible, it's kind of interesting. I've given you some things, and I've not given you every verse of, and everything that talks about all of these foods, but I've given you enough, and we'll cover some of this, and I'll let you cover the rest, look at it, the rest. But I want us to talk about what is on your outline. First of all, let's just foods themselves, and then as we have time, we'll talk about some of the customs with regards to eating that they had. The mainstay was bread, always has been, always will be, I guess. Bread was what it was made out of, sort of was the economic indicator. If you were rich, you had wheat bread. If you were poor, you ate barley. It was cheaper, always has been. And so while there were other breads, as your outline says, such as corn, it was not the same. Corn in the arid countries of Palestine is not the same as our corn. They don't have the moisture in order to produce the the corn. But they did have called corn. They also had millet. And these grains, as you know, they were harvested, especially the wheat grain, the barley grain. Barley, much like wheat, had a head on it, and you would take it. And what they would do is they would take it, they would gather it. They would have those that would come in with sickles and cut it down, and then a lot of times it was the ladies that would go in and they would gather it up. And remember, we talked a little bit about this Sunday, and we were studying the book of Ruth in the sermon, that part of the old law said you had to leave the corners for the poor, and there would also be some left in the fields. But the women often gather it together, and then it would be carried to a threshing floor. And often it was just that. It was a lot of times just beating the heads of the wheat or the barley, especially beating it on the floor. And then, of course, with that would come the chaff, and you would take the all of it, and you would sometimes take it in a scoop, sometimes just by hand, and you would take it up, and the breeze would blow the chaff away, and the grain would fall straight down. Of course, that still means that you would have some chaff, if you will, but that was sort of their way of separating the two. And then it moved to a time of milling the grain, and there were two or three different size mills. One was a mill that was anywhere from 18 inches to 24 inches across in diameter, smaller. It could be, you could do it with a hand. It had a lower stone, and it had a stone on top. And if you've ever gone, I got to thinking about this today as I was thinking about all this. If you've ever gone to and you've gone to Cades Cove, especially, and you go all the way to the back of Cades Cove where the restrooms are. That's our favorite stop, where the restrooms are. But there's several, there's back there. But there's a mill back there, and it's the bigger one, and we'll talk about that in a second. Even in the small mill, you'd have a center of the wheel, and it would be hollowed out. And what would happen is you would pour, say, your wheat into that center, and then you would take the top stone and you would turn it around and around and around. And eventually, as it ground it, it would push that which was ground out sides, and they would gather it. And that was the smaller mills. The larger mills, and those mills worked the same way, except they were too big. Matter of fact, a stone itself was said to be 2,000 pounds. And so animals would be attached to the larger mills, and it would literally, these oxen, say, would continuously just walk in the circle. And as they walked in the circle, they're attached into the stone, and pour the grain in the center, and it would pour out, and it would be pushed out, and it would be gathered. You might say, well, how is that? What does that mean to us? I want you to see an interesting thought. Look in Matthew chapter 18. Now, it's interesting when, a side note, not from Matthew 18, but when we always wonder about whether to pay the preacher or not, and we turn to the book of 1 Corinthians where Paul talks about don't muzzle the ox, that one of the things they did while they were grinding that wheat is there would be in that circle, if you will, where those oxen would constantly walk, there would be food, and they could gather a little food, maybe stop for just a second and eat a little bit, and then they'd get on up. They didn't muzzle the ox to keep them from, so that they were just continually beasts of burden that only worked. They fed them along the way. But Matthew 18, that was just a side note. In Matthew chapter 18, there's an interesting point here that I often like to make when I'm studying this text. Let's go back, if you don't mind, to verse 2. and begin there. Well, let's begin in verse 1. Questions asked, who's greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Jesus called a little child to him, set him in the midst of them, and said, assuredly I say to you, unless you are converted and become as little children, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever humbles himself as this little child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever receives one little child like this in my name receives me. But whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him if a millstone were hung about his neck and they were drowned in the depths of the sea. Woe to the world because of the offenses, for offense must come, but woe to that man by whom the offenses come. Look in verse 6. It would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were drowned in the depths of the sea. The millstone there is not the small handheld. The Greek word is for this huge 2,000-pound rock. He says, if you cause one of these children to stumble, if you cause one of these children to do what? Notice what he says, who believes in me, you cause them to sin. He said, if we just tied a big old 2,000-pound millstone around your neck, cast you off into the sea and let you drown, as to cause one of these children to sin. It's just interesting to me because he didn't use the word the small mill. He used the big mill. And that's how, if we understand these things, the scriptures come alive for us, maybe more so than normal. And so why was a mill important? Look in Deuteronomy chapter 24. I want you to see something that is fascinating, I think, as well. Deuteronomy chapter 24 and verse 6. This is, if you look in Deuteronomy 24, it's seemingly just one thing after another. He begins by talking about divorce, but he's just it's just part of the law, and the law that God had given to the children of Israel. And he makes this statement in verse 6 of Deuteronomy 24. No man shall take the lower or upper millstone in pledge, for he takes one's living pledge. In other words, bread was so important in the Old Testament that if you were going to borrow money, you could not pledge, nor could you, if you were giving the money to someone, you could not take in pledge their millstone or that which they had access to. And so consequently, he says, you can't do that, because if you do, you're taking away his living, you're taking away his life, you're killing him. And so that's how important these millstones and these mills and grinding of the wheat, grinding of the barley, grinding of the millet, that's how important it was to them. Now, we ask ourselves, did they cook it? The answer is yes. They had very different, if you will, furnaces which they would use and ways in which they would cook them. Some would have ovens that, for lack of a better term, were really dug into the ground. They were pits, we would call them, but they were pits, and they would light fires in those pits. And in those pits would be rock, and they would get the rocks red hot and either take out what they used for fuel. Do you remember what they used for fuel? Matthew chapter 6. Well, yeah. that was one of them. Yeah. You didn't use those. You didn't use those rocks. Yeah. But in Matthew chapter 6, remember where Jesus is talking about, beginning in verse 25 in the Sermon on the Mount, about worry? And he talks about the lilies of the field, how they grow, they toil not, neither do they spin. Yet I say to you, Solomon in all of his glory is not arrayed like one of these. Behold the grass of the field. What does he say about the grass? Which today is, tomorrow is cut down. What's it used for? It was the fuel. They had a few twigs around, but they also had the grass, and that's what was used to start these fires. And then they also had earthen ovens made out of earthen clay, and they could start a fire in it. And once again, they often would take the fuel out, and they had rocks. What they would do is they would take this bread, this grain that they would make, they'd mix it, and we're not real sure, but we think that they mixed it with water or milk and salt. They kneaded it together, they pushed it all together, and then they made it flat, sort of like what we would think of as a cracker. They made it flat, and then they'd lay it on these hot stones, and then it would cook. And it is said, it is believed, let's put it like this, archaeologists believe that they did have a device, don't know what exactly it was, but it was a device that could turn it over. In other words, they didn't eat it just half cooked. But the rocks themselves, like say they'd lay this paste on it, and these rocks themselves would then cook the bread, and then they'd turn it over to the side. And so you had bread that was cooked. You say, well, we have bread that's cooked too, but what does our bread have that their bread sometimes had? Yeast, leaven. In Matthew 26, remember Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper. And remember that at that time, because of the feast that they were honoring, what was not in the house? Yeast, leaven. So the bread was what? Flat. It was like a cracker, if you will. And so in Matthew 26, where Matthew says that he took the bread and broke it, at first we might say that makes no sense. But when we understand bread, we understand that idea of breaking bread. That's why we use what we use today in our Lord's Supper, which I love our Lord's Supper better now than first what year we used it in the pandemic. But we got to the right kind. Yeah, this is far better. What did I was listening to who was I listening to? I was listening to the preacher at Walnut Street, and he called I don't know what they're doing now for Lord's Supper, but anyway, he called it rip it and sip it. All of us preachers, I've never heard any preacher call it that, but he called it rip it and sip it. He was talking about the Lord's Supper, preaching on the Lord's Supper, and anyway, but that makes sense then, doesn't it? They also, with regards to ovens, they had small portable ovens. But if a community was big enough, there'd be a community oven. And so you would go and sort of wait in line and cook your bread and or whatever you were going to have. And so this was important. If you look, I want to save some time. I want you to look under F, under point number 1. It says some examples of bread in the Bible. I want you to underline Exodus 16. Exodus 16, and just read the whole chapter there. That gives you some great insight. Now, all the other are references to bread as well, but that gives you some great information. Anything anybody like to add about bread? Well, how about vegetables and fruits? There were a variety that are mentioned in the Bible. Lentils were a small pea-like plant, was a favorite of a lot of folks. Remember Genesis 25? Do you remember? Turn over there right quick. Genesis 25. I think we got time. Genesis 25, beginning in verse 27. There was this constant sibling rivalry between Jacob and Esau, right? Beginning in verse 27 of Genesis 25, it makes this statement. So the boys grew. Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, but Jacob was a mild man, dwelling in tents. Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Now Jacob cooked a stew, and Esau came in from the field, and he was weary. And Esau said to Jacob, please feed me with that same red stew, which was lentil stew. For I am weary. Therefore, his name was called Edom. But Jacob said, sell me your birthright as of this day. And Esau said, look, I'm about to die. So what is this birthright to me? Then Jacob said, swear to me as of this day. So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. And Jacob gave Esau bread and stew of lentils. Then he ate and drank, arose and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. Esau sold his birthright for soup. That's all it was. It was a bowl of soup. But he said, hey, I'm dying of hunger. And so he was willing to sell it. But this was something that they ate. They also ate cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, garlic, are some of the things that they ate. You might say they ate melons. If you go back to the book of Exodus and the children of Israel are wandering in the wilderness, one of the things they say is we just soon be back in Egypt, yeah, and eat the cucumbers and eat the melons. And so, yeah, they did, and it was probably more prevalent in that area than say get up into Palestine. Reason being because they were down. When you talk about that area, you're talking about the Nile River, you're talking about more fertile land, a little bit more rainfall as well, and so possibility of growing melons. And an interesting thing that I came across has nothing to do with food, so to speak, but I came across this today, and I had never seen this till today, that in these fields, especially like melon fields, but also in the cucumber fields and in some of the other fields, that to keep the animals out, but also more importantly, keep those that would come and steal from them out, they would build, for lack of a term, huts, but they weren't really huts. They were just sort of take all the vines and different things and sort of make a camouflage area. And the people, the guards, I guess, for lack of a better term, would sit in them from daylight to dark and dark to daylight. In other words, all the time, and guard the fields. And then when the harvest came, then they would just leave those. And then next year they'd do the same thing over and over. I'd never heard that before, but found it to be true, evidently, and very interesting. But anyway, it has nothing to do with anything. Olives and grapes were popular. They green olives, ripe olives. Olives were more important from the standpoint of oil. And I've given you some of the uses for oil that they used it for in Bible. Signs of mourning, rejoicing. Oftentimes it was you poured oil upon a person's head. It was used for medicine. It was used as preservative for leather. It was used for baking. It was used for fuel for lamps. One olive tree, if it has a decent year, will produce 12 gallons of olive oil per year. What is interesting about olive trees is that they grow in groves. They don't grow just like one here and one there and one over here and one over there. They grow in clusters or groves. And the press that was used in biblical times for pressing out the oil from the olives, the Greek term is the word gashima. Now, guess where that would be? Gethsemane. Gethsemane literally means the grove. It's believed, remember Jesus went into the Garden of Gethsemane. It is believed that the Garden of Gethsemane had a couple of things, that it was basically just a grove of olive trees, but it also had a press in the middle of it. And that's the way most of them would use. And so somewhere in there, Jesus went in and prayed. Probably one of the things to explain there that has nothing to do with food, but to explain is that a garden in biblical times is not the garden that we think of. We think of a garden with rows and things like that. The gardens that they had were sort of like the wooded areas of Central Park in New York City. Now, I haven't been in them, but I've seen pictures of them, and I understand Central Park's huge, and I understand there are places that, where you can play games and so forth and so, but there are wooded areas. And that's kind of the way their gardens in New Testament times were. They were wooded areas oftentimes. And so went into the Gethsemane, and there was an olive press. There would have been olives there. And so Jesus went in there, of course, and prayed in Matthew 26. Other fruits and vegetables, figs. I want you to see some figs. Figs were one, apples, apricots, nuts are mentioned in the Bible, almonds, pistachios, honey. Who ate honey in the New Testament? John the Baptizer ate honey in the New Testament. I want you to look in Mark chapter 11. I want to show you something. Something I know you already know, or I believe you already know, but share it with you. The last week of the life of Christ, Jesus went traveling from Bethany to Jerusalem. Now, this is only about a 20 to 30-minute walk, so it's not far. But Bethany, if you came out of Bethany, you kind of went south. You had to go south to Jerusalem, and you'd come out of Bethany, go down a little sort of valley-like, a nice valley, meadow-like, and cross over it, and then go up into Jerusalem. As Jesus made this trip, day after day, that last week, look beginning with me in Mark chapter 11, verse 12. Now, the next day, when they had come out from Bethany, he, Jesus, was hungry. And seeing from afar a fig tree having leaves, he went to see if perhaps he would find something on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. In response, Jesus said to it, "Let no one eat fruit from you ever again." And his disciples heard it. Now let's just stop right there. Okay. Now, fig tree, and Jesus approaches it. Why would there have been an expectation by Jesus that there would be figs on a fig tree? Because it says it was not the season. In New Testament times, their fig trees produced figs before they produced leaves. And so when he saw the fig tree had leaves on it, his hope was that there would be maybe some either dried or some maybe just, late bloomers, so to speak, that he would get a fig tree. When he saw the leaves, he went to the tree believing he would find something, and he found nothing. And he cursed the tree. Now, if you keep reading in the book of Mark, the fascinating aspect is that when they come back, what's happened to the tree? Withered up. This is the only miracle that we have recorded that has a negative result. And so, interesting. But that's just, I've always enjoyed that story just to see the power of the Lord. Anything else about fruits and vegetables? All right. Then you had meat. Under the old law, under the Mosaic law, you could eat only what kind of meat? Clean meat, which means you couldn't eat what? Unclean. There you go. Y'all catching on. Now give me some classifications of animals that would be considered unclean. Yep. You could not be a Southern boy and grow up under the Mosaic law. You couldn't. That's just, you had to eat certain things. And I've given you a list there. Animals with parted hoofs that chewed their cud, such as cattle, sheep, deer, gazelles, you could eat them. You couldn't eat camels. You couldn't eat swine. Of course, camels, their hoof kept them out of it, but also camels were so useful. They could go for long periods of time without water. They could carry a tremendous amount of weight. They could carry a tremendous amount of weight for days. And so they were quite useful, but nevertheless, you couldn't eat them. You had to eat fish with the fins and scales. The fowls of the air that you could eat were those that were not meat eaters. So they ate pigeons, partridges, quail, geese, but they didn't eat like vultures, owls. They didn't eat those kinds of animals, those kinds of birds. They ate insects. Who ate insects in the Bible? John did. Locusts and wild honey. I researched that a little bit today because I wanted to gross you out. Now, they're talking now about us should eat bugs. We should eat more bugs. They're talking about that, and they're talking about they're high in protein and so forth and so on. Now, I'm going to tell you now, give me a piece of meat, you can have the bugs, okay? But they say mealworms and things like that, they're good for you. But a lot of times what they did in biblical times, what they did with regards to the bugs, the locusts say, is that they would take them, they would dry them out, they would set them out, and they'd let them dry out. And then they would take them and use them as a garnish, or they would sprinkle them over the food that you were going to eat. And so I mean, if it had, well, they had to eat, man. Anyway, Wayne Jackson in his book talking about biblical backgrounds said these eating restrictions, and he listed these passages in Exodus and Leviticus that I have listed for you as well, were all designed to set Israel apart as being holy. But if you also think about it, there was a sense of hygiene with regards to that. And so this not only separated Israel as a holy nation, but it also sort of kept them healthy, if you will. There were meat restrictions, but when we removed 7, and when I was studying this today, I don't know if this had ever hit me till today. The Acts 10 passage we'll look at in a minute had, but the Mark 7 passage, I'm not sure it had ever hit me this way in thinking about it. In Mark chapter 7, when he entered a house, this is verse 17, excuse me, Mark 7, verse 17. When he entered a house away from the crowd, his disciples asked him concerning the parable. So he said to them, are you thus without understanding also? Do you not perceive that whatever enters a man from outside cannot defile him? Now he's talking about what defiles a man and how does it defile? Really, all of back at least to verse 4. Didn't. But anyway, he says, you need to understand something. Whatever enters a man from the outside cannot hurt him, not defile him, make him unclean. But he does say, and it's eliminated all foods. That last statement, thus purifying all foods, is really believed. Like I say, I may have missed this for years. That this, if not, well, of course, it couldn't have happened yet because Jesus hadn't died on the cross. But this was Jesus telling folks that it's not the food that you eat. Sort of paving the way for then now turn to Acts chapter 10. I know you know this story. Yeah. Verse 14. Yeah. Right. Yeah, it's see, that's another aspect with regards to this is this in the text that when you get down to textual criticism, is this part of the text or is this something that was added later on? And I think, let me look back, the word thus for me is in italics, which means it's questionable whether it's in the text. But but he goes on to say, purifying all foods. But thus is in there, put in there to, how can I explain this easy? When you translate, translations such as New King James, American Standard, New American Standard, try to be as literal as possible to the text. But sometimes words have to be added to make it read smoothly because it doesn't translate smoothly. And the word thus is added to make it read smoothly. I'm not saying that it's correct, because that's a choice that the translators have to make. What? Verse 19. Thus, he says, because it does not enter his heart, but his stomach, and is eliminated, purifying all foods. See, that doesn't sound right. There has to be something added. And the King James translators and New King James put the word thus in there, thus purifying all food. This would be, and like I say, doesn't have at all, or just has the word thus. Yeah. This is why it was not right. Yeah, he just right. What I was thinking, it part of it was there at least. Like I say, this doesn't mean that at that point, because like I say, they were still under which law at that point? Yeah, they were still under the old law. Christ, the old law stayed into effect till when? Christ died, right? At the cross. And so they were still under it. But by the time you get to Acts 10, and we're not going to take the time to read all of it, but beginning in verse 9, you have the story of who? Peter and who? Cornelius. And remember the dropping of the sheet? And basically God said you could take anything you wanted to. You could eat swine. You could eat swine. You know, I'm a Southern boy. Barbecue and you know, and catfish. Those are my two favorites. And so, you know, I like a good steak. I don't eat one very often. I like a good steak, but you know, I like the barbecue and the catfish. Well, that's and bacon. Yeah, and bacon. Yes, and bacon. Don't forget. Yeah, I shouldn't forget the bacon. And then, of course, Colossians 2, verse 14, 16 allows for the eating of meat and not regulating it. And matter of fact, then in 1 Timothy chapter 4, verses 1 through 4, he talks about in the great apostasy, those that deny the eating of meats. So God allows for meat. Well, meat was used. Now here's something else. Meat was used, but it was not used at every meal. You know, now if I sit down to eat a meal, I will eat an all vegetable plate. But I really like some sort of meat to go with that all vegetable plate, right? They ate a lot of times all vegetable, or sometimes just bread. The eating, if you will, of meat was special because of the price. And have you ever noticed? Let's see, maybe we've got time. Luke 15. Let's look over there. I want you to see something. Luke 15. I want you to look in verse 23. This is the story of the prodigal son. And you know the story. I'm not going to get into it, but I want you to see something. When the son came home, remember what the dad said? Look in verse 23. Bring the fatted calf here, kill it, and let us eat and be merry. The fatted calf. Now look in verse 29. Remember the older son that stayed home? Remember when he saw the party that was going on? He threw a fit, right? And he said, Lo, these many years I've been serving you. I never transgressed your commandment at any time, and yet you never gave me a young goat that I might make merry with my friends. There's a difference. The father calls for a calf. The older son says, you just didn't give me a goat. A goat was cheap food. Go was really what the poor people ate. The father called the very best, and the son said, "You never even gave me the least." Now, the older son was mistaken about some things. He was blessed while he was there, the father says. But it is interesting to see the difference there and to understand the difference from a biblical standpoint of time. If you were like most everybody, if you had meat, you had a goat. And if you had money, you didn't. You had maybe a calf, a young tender calf. I want you to flip over on your page. I want you to see a couple of things. Um, Jim, I thought of you this morning as I was thinking about this. They don't eat a whole lot of breakfast. And if they eat lunch, they just snack. And then they eat supper. That's pretty much what Jim does, I think, from what I can gather. And that's they do have those three separate times, but the morning breakfast is a light breakfast, maybe a little bread. The lunch, they might kind of just eat it on the run, a few grains, little snacks. That time is used for naps as well. And then supper time, when it got cooler, there was a breeze blowing more often than not, and that's when they would sit down, and that's when they would have a large meal. I agree with you. I agree with you. Yeah, yeah. So that was some of the things. Uh, Customs, you already know a lot of the customs. They did have dishes, but they didn't have eating utensils. What'd you eat with? Your hands. Yeah. And a lot of times, the idea of sopping up your bread. And sometimes they would take a big chunk of bread and they would put it in this bowl and they'd sop up the juices, and the host would give it to those that were there. Here's yours and here's yours. You think, okay, you won't eat certain foods, maybe at least because it's hygiene, but you don't mind passing. Don't touch my bread, but they would. And there were other things that they did. They also, here's one thing that is important, and once again, if you've read Matthew 14:19, that will help you to grasp hold of this. And I think this was important. He commanded the multitude to sit down on the grass. He took the 5 loaves, the 2 fishes. By the way, the 5 loaves here, you remember what they were made of? This is feeding the 5,000 little boy. Remember what they're made of? Barley, poor man's food. The fishes were probably we do have a time in which fresh fish were eaten. Do you remember? All right, I'm going to give you that as an assignment. Fish fry on the beach. Yeah, that was the only time. They pickled fish. They were smaller. They would remind us really of sardines. And there were 2 or 3 places in Palestine that were well known to be fish pickler. They pickled fish. Pickleries. Yeah, there you go. And so, but I wanted you to see Matthew 14:19. He took the 5 loaves, 2 fishes, and looking up to heaven, he blessed and broke the disciples, and the disciples gave to the multitude. They blessed the meals. And that's a good thing for us to remember is they blessed them. Remember tables in Old Testament time. Table in Old Testament time was pretty much just kind of a lot of times it was just fur, but it was usually a round circle, and you would sit around it. And this was Old Testament times. You would sit around it and you would eat. You'd either sit what we would call Indian style, or you could recline, and you'd eat your food. And then they would take that circle of fur or canvas, they would take it up and they would hang it on the wall when they weren't eating. By biblical times, you had short tables, not very high off the ground, or some were even closer to the ground than that, but just inches off the ground. And you would recline. You would either you could put your elbows on the table. You'd put your left elbow on the table or on the ground beside it, and you would actually you would hold your head, and you would feed yourself with your right hand. And when it talks about sitting in the bosom, what they would do is you could recline several people at a small table, and especially if you were the one right next to the host, you were right up in, so to speak, his chest, you were said to be in his bosom. And so that's where that statement, that thought came from. And so, anything else? Well, I know it's time, and the ladies probably want to just go home tonight and read Revelation 3:20 and kind of think about that. I didn't think about manna because manna, we don't know from a standpoint of really what it was. It's classified when you get to looking at books, textbooks, it's classified as a bread. And we do know that it was in abundance. We do know that it was provided for the children of Israel for how often? 6 days. I was wanting somebody to say 7. 6 days a week. And for how many years? 40 years. And so they had manna, they had quail. Manna was said to, we believe that it had a sweeter taste to it. There's a statement in Exodus that leads to believe that it was a sweeter bread. From a standpoint of where did it come from, I personally, it's a miracle of God. And I've seen explanations, but they don't hold up. Most of them say that it came from a tree, but the tree was in a certain area and only produces for about 2 months out of the year. God did this for every day, 6 days a week for 40 years. So anyway, that gives you some insight into how they ate. Next week, we're going to look at the government. We're going to look at the government from the standpoint of in Old Testament times and in New Testament times, and we'll try not to throw just more at you than you can bear, but we'll try to give you a healthy enough outline that you can go home and study it, pick it up. Anything else? The ladies are shhing back there. So let's bow for a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, we're thankful for this day, blessing of it, for the beautiful sunshine that we had. We're thankful that you love us and watch over us, and we ask your richest blessings upon us, that we may always study your word, and that as we find these little things, that the text will become a little bit more alive to us, and we can appreciate then exactly the truths that you're teaching us. We ask that you be with us now, that you watch over us, bless us, and keep us, and hold us as we hold to you. For this is our prayer in Christ's name. Amen. Y'all have a great week. Thank y'all.